Mark. Thanks for being with us.
You bet, Lisa. Tim, thanks so much for having me.
So let's start at the beginning of Mosaix Church. I really want to hear you talk about what led you to start a multi-ethnic and economically diverse church at the heart of Central Arkansas, really. So give us a bit of a brief overview of the 20-year history of Mosaix Church and where you are today.
You bet. Well, it all began when I was born in San Francisco, 1961. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going that far back. But seriously, I had come to Little Rock after 10 years of student ministry in various settings in the Western United States. Came to a very large church, 1993, very well-known church at the time, and even still today. 1993, 2,000 folks there, about 150 7th through 12th graders. I was brought to essentially revitalize, if not build, a much more robust student ministry. It was a church there. So I came there in 93. That church grew from 2,000 to 5,000 people. My youth group from 150 to 600 in the next 8 years. I went from 1 administrative assistant to 9 full-time staff just through 7th through 12th grade. The senior pastor handed me a check, so to speak, for $3.5 million, says, go build a student center. Built 3 full courts, 36-foot climbing wall. One day I went to him, I said, hey, I think I need to hire another person on my staff. He said, no, you need 3. And I got 3 people, right? So my point is, I'm living the dream. You know, I got 250 volunteers, 9 full-time staff, 500 kids in small groups. I'm in this amazing church. It's not only locally impacting the community, but also nationally. And one day in 1997, which happened to be the 40th anniversary of Little Rock Central High, second stop in the American Civil Rights Movement, I looked around this otherwise amazing church and realized the only people of color were janitors. And that began to bother me. But I didn't know why in 1997 that began to bother me. But something about that didn't sit well. And of course, in Little Rock at the time, I'm going to say at least 42% of the population was African American. So I realized I was in a large, white, homogeneous, suburban, upper-class Republican church. And I'd never thought about that in 14 or 15 years of ministry until that one morning that kind of dawned on me. And again, I didn't understand it at the time. And so I continued in that church for the next 3 or 4 years doing my student ministry thing. But on the side, I had a master's of exegetical theology at the time, now a DMin, doctorate in that. And I started doing my own research, if you will, into the nature of the New Testament church. Was the New Testament church, as I had been taught in seminary, Jewish believers went to Jewish churches, Gentile believers to Gentile churches? Was it homogeneous in that sense, right? Was the way to plant, grow, and develop churches in the United States what Donald McGavran mined and called the homogeneous unit principle, right? Focus on a single people group, a demographic, if you will, and essentially give them everything you want. That's how people get saved. That's how the church grows. Did that match the church planning strategy, if you will, of the New Testament? My exegetical research, if you will, over the next few years realized no. Men and women, Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, all walked, worked, and worshiped God together as one in local churches in the New Testament. And this, more than the explanation of the gospel, that demonstration of Christ being lifted up, able to draw all people into himself, is what propelled the gospel forward. That the homogeneous unit principle, as taught by Donald McGavran, was an evangelistic discipleship strategy, not ever intended to be what later became a church growth strategy. So once I realized this from a theological perspective, in other words, I didn't set out to plant a multi-ethnic church because of changing demographics, or later because Barack Obama is biracial and somehow represents the changing complexion, if you will, of the United States. All that's well and good, but I needed to know for myself if what I was feeling and the check in my spirit matched or didn't match what was in the New Testament. In other words, it was the theology. It was the exegetical theology, recognizing the kingdom of God on earth, or is at hand, is to be a reflection of Revelation 7:9 on earth as it is in heaven, to advance a credible witness of God's love for all people, not just some. Once all that got into my belly, then in 2001, I left that church, not in a huff. I mean, I said goodbye, 3 standing ovations. We all parted ways in a healthy way. but I determined to remain in Little Rock, come to the inner city, an area, the 72204 zip code, 66% of kids born without dads in the home, highest violent crime in the city, 30% at that time poverty, at or below poverty, determined to what Christianity today would call 3 years later, a big dream in Little Rock. Could diverse men and women will themselves to walk, work, and worship God together as one, again, to advance a credible gospel in an increasingly diverse society? Christ taught us to pray, right? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, where? On earth as it is in heaven. And I began to ask myself, and I set out in 2001 to answer this question: if the kingdom of heaven is not segregated, why on earth is the church? And that led me again in the summer of 2001 to plant Mosaix Church of Central Arkansas, right here in the 72204 zip code, which now we've been in 22 years. But in church planning, you conceive the child, then you give birth. So we just crossed 20 years earlier this year in 2022 at Easter. So we're now over 20 years old as a church.
Fabulous. And I've been in that space, and for anyone who wants to learn about what it is to be in a community and to mirror the community and serve and be served by the community, I just encourage folks to visit Mosaix Church and to experience it. I would love for you to talk a little bit about what it looks like today. And I mean looks like, but I also mean, what are those ministries? What's the texture? What is Mosaix Church today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, it comes from kind of the formation of the church, because when I left, so I come out with this idealistic, very biblical dream, but I left the mega white, whatever world you want to call it, Republican, money, and I came to the inner city. And very quickly we realized the more people that joined your church, it cost you money. Yeah. So you think about that, right? Like in the suburbs, the more people join your church, you make money, if you will, as people put tithes and offerings in. In the inner city, people don't put money into the plate, they take money out of the plate. So very quickly we had kind of the slap on the face realization, something is different about the nature of what it is we're trying to do. And it wasn't about money to sustain the church in its spiritual aspect, but the needs of the communities I just mentioned, from crime to poverty to food insecurity, now is a big term, right? There were so many needs in this community. And very quickly, our team that planted this church, we realized that tithes and offerings would not be enough to meet the bold challenges and needs in this community. We were going to have to develop multiple streams of income. And so with that in mind, what the church looks like today in terms of structure is, think about an American football team, right? So an American football team is actually a team of teams. We don't typically think about it like that, but it's a team of teams, right? There's the offense, the defense, and the special teams. And each one of those are three separate teams playing synergistically together, hopefully, so that the macro team wins. Those teams are so different. They play different games. They have different coaches. We call them coordinators. They have different players who specialize in those games. So when the offense is on the field, the defense is not, or special teams. And the metrics are different, right? When defense walks off the field, you don't say, how many points did you score? They'd say, that's not our job. Our job is to stop the other team from scoring points. And the games are so different, that players, the coaches, the playbook, the metrics. And as we all know, you can have a great offensive performance, but if defense can't stop the run, you lose. Or you could have a great offensive defensive performance, but if the kick goes bad, the hold goes bad, the snap goes bad, in 3 seconds at the end of the game, special teams failed and the whole team loses. Now, what does that have to do with what we learned and how we set out, and how does it look like today? Structurally, again, we moved from a single dimensional game, let's call that a spiritual game, evangelism, discipleship, etc., all the things, worship, small groups. Yes, we still play that game, but most churches in America, they only have an offense, if you will. They don't have they don't have defense, and they don't have special teams, right? And so we structured to, in a sense, create a spiritual playbook that was multi-ethnic, and that's the first leg of a three-legged stool. Then we created a separate 501c3 community development corporation nonprofit. It's an umbrella nonprofit under which we aggregated all our justice, compassion, and mercy work. And rather than have any of that under the spiritual team, if you will, the first leg of the stool, the church, we put all that work under a nonprofit. Why? Because then you can qualify for local, state, federal grants. Other churches will send you money. Other churches will send you people. But if all that's under the church, they won't. And or you won't be able to get grants, donations, et cetera, from outside the church. And then the third leg was what we call church economics, setting up a profitable ROI operation to leverage the assets of the church, people, money, and facilities to generate true ROI. And in terms of finance, then the aggregate of tithes and offerings on your spiritual team, grants and donations on your social team, if you will, ROI, for-profit revenue on your financial team, the aggregate of that is what funds our work and allows us to be aggressive in meeting the bold challenges and the needs of this community, helping to reduce crime by 19% since we've been here, dropping the poverty rate from 30 to 22%, generating financial investment in this community of over $20 million to the point where the church wins a statewide award for economic development in the entire state of Arkansas. Now, that sounds like I'm patting myself on the back, and I'm not. The principle is the biblical principle is Matthew 5:16. And we live in a Matthew 5:16 century. Jesus didn't say, let them hear your good words. He said, let them see your good works. And when we have, as we do, the largest food distribution in the city of Little Rock, immigration counseling, we've helped over 12,000 immigrants since 2005 to help get their immigration status correct for literally $350 a case, not an hour. When you have an award-winning chess program for at-risk kids in the inner city, et cetera, these are the things, the good works that they see, and the church gets credit, which is at the end of the day, glorifying the Lord, right? And literally yesterday at food distribution, there's a gentleman standing outside. He's smoking a cigarette. He's an older African-American man. And he came up to me and he said, thank you so much for this church being here in this community and all that you do. And this guy, I don't know if he was homeless, but he kind of looked like that, an unsheltered person. But you see what I'm saying? And that's to the glory of God. So structurally, that's the way it looks. In terms of its complexion, to use that, yeah, there's about 25 to 30 nations. Remember, Little Rock isn't like Portland or Seattle or LA. So you only have so much demographic diversity, but we have about 25 different nations in the church. Structurally, it's completely multi-ethnic. Acts 13:1, the leadership of the church at Antioch was diverse. So, our elder chairman is Puerto Rican, our senior pastor is Chinese. I mean, there's African-American, Black, white, Asian, all in responsible positions of authority that then informs the structures of the church and helps then make us not a perfect church by any means, but a generally healthy, multi-ethnic church, again, to the glory of God.
Mark, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I want to sort of double click on something that you just said, in that when you were talking through the metaphors of the football team, essentially what you're talking about is how Mosaix has begun to think, you could say about, and maybe I think you're comfortable with this language, maybe not all of our listeners will be, but reimagining the business model of the church. That's part of what you've done. I have been thinking about this for a while, and I want to get your reaction. You tell me if I'm like way off, and I'm curious about your reflection, having been there, as you said, and congratulations for 20 years. That really is, frankly, incredible. But I think it was maybe Peter Drucker who said, I'm sure most people have heard this quote, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Have you all heard this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I think is true and is like an interesting thing to talk about. But I want to take that a step further and get your reaction, particularly from your experience. I think it's possible that business models eventually eat culture for lunch, meaning increasingly, I think that the business model of the church forms us corporately and individually in ways that we don't often talk about. And you just kind of did. You talked about the business model of the church. So I know that's kind of maybe a new idea. Feel free to push back on it and say, well, that's ridiculous. But you have pioneered some new ways of thinking about that. You could say the business model of the church and how it forms and shapes us, not just congregationally, but like our imagination as disciples of Christ. Could you
Mhm.
like just play with that for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a great observation, Tim. At a macro level, you just say desperation leads to innovation, right? I mean, like if you're in the inner city and you're desperate because people are ringing your door, we need food, we need shelter, we need pharmaceuticals. This person's on fentanyl. I mean, we're in a community. I was telling the former head of Arkansas Energy earlier this morning. I mean, we've had 3 people die on our doorstep during the pandemic. Yesterday, one of our unsheltered guests was shot just literally probably 1 block from the church. Unsheltered woman who we pay in our nonprofit to run our food distribution. She found him dead. I mean, that's the environment we're in. And so again, I could take my nice little paycheck, tithes and offerings, and have my little 150 people, and I got a nice little house in the suburbs. But if we're going to be aggressive on that in the inner city, tithes and offerings doesn't do it. So desperation led to innovation. Now, a second thing I'd say is, and we were desperate for God, if you will. We were desperate to advance the cause of Christ by meeting the needs of this community. And that's the desperation I'm talking about, not desperate so I can get a paycheck. Okay. So number 2, literally about 3 months ago, the only major grocery store anywhere close to this community shut down its operations. I won't name the national chain that starts with a K, so I don't, whatever, but that's another story. But they shut down. And this goes back to your business model, because they have a business model. This is what I believe. They have a business model, and the company's out of Cincinnati. Now you're in the South, and in other parts of this community, their business model works, but their business model is not adaptive to this community, to this culture, if you will. And so they've been here for many years, but losing ground. And then ultimately they leave, which throws us into a food desert, which we already got 22% poverty. And I'm like, you have to adapt your business model to this community. Because, if you're playing the way you play in the suburbs here, yeah, it's not going to work. So how can you make your margins in a different way that'll keep you here? One of the ways we have done that is by coming up with and writing about and doing here is benevolent ownership. You have to have people who own buildings and own land who aren't in it for top dollar. Okay? Because if you're in it for top dollar, you're going to charge the highest rates in terms of square footage pricing. You're going to lock people in for 10 years. You can adjust your services, your employees, your hours, but you can't change that mortgage payment, that rent payment, what have you. And that's what puts pressure on small business. And then they pass that on to the community. That's why you're paying $7 for a cup of coffee at Starbucks. But if you have churches with our vast wealth, literally hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, I would suggest buried in the ground. That's another story right now. But if we turned on that economics engine and played benevolent owner, we can bring in these people, because I'm not in it for top dollar. I already explained, I got tithes and offerings, I got grants and donations, but we can't just give this stuff away for free. I don't need top dollar, but I'm not giving it away for free. That's called biblical stewardship. And the point is, then we can attract that type of business, lower the price for goods and services that actually blesses the community, and everybody wins. The church wins, the business wins, the community wins. And that's flipping some of that stuff upside down. So that would be a second thing that I see in the inner city in terms of business model, strategy, culture. Now, that's secular business. One final thing in terms of the church culture, like you're saying, same way. The same way as in business, which I mentioned. If you come to the inner city and you think you're going to do business, you got to listen, you got to learn, you got to adapt. Right? From the very beginning, another metaphor we saw ourselves and realized quickly we are Navy SEALs, right? Think about the Navy SEALs. They get some basic training, and it's way more than basic, trust me. But let's say it like this. Think about the Air Force. You got fighter jets and Air Force carriers. Think about a carrier. It's got 3,000 soldiers on it. You got to have the kitchen. You got to have cooks. Think about the overhead of the Air Force. Think about the overhead of the Army, and if it was business. Think about the overhead of the Navy SEALs. How do you accomplish mission? You say, here's the macro mission. Here's a rucksack, 200 pounds. They drop you in behind enemy lines, and they say, good luck. Figure it out. You try to bring the Air Force into behind like a Navy. You can't win a war like that. So in a very similar sense, for the American church, if you keep playing with a 20th century metric and you think everywhere you go, you can just drop your metric in to a culture, right? It's not going to work. And that's what happens. So then you have the white flight of society affects the white flight of the church, because the church doesn't know how to be generally adaptive. Now, of course, I'm talking primarily about the white church, both mainline and evangelical. But of course, inner city pastors, largely African-American, forever in this country, they long ago figured out how to be adapted. That's what gave rise to bivocational, etc., community development corporations, because they realized, just like me as a white guy, I'm white, Italian, Russian, Jew, by the way, I came to the inner city, I learned all this stuff. And then I adapted the way African-American pastors have had to adapt for, decades, if not longer, to actually have a thriving imprint on the community. Because if I transport white evangelicalism, and I shouldn't say white, but evangelicalism mainline, largely white, et cetera, as it's been historically, and the money that's involved in the business model, yeah, that's not going to work. And you see this time and time again. I know you do, Tim. You've seen it, Lisa, probably as well. You see churches with good, and they'll go into some place for 7 years and then they pull out. 5 years and they pull out, or even from the beginning, they don't make it, because they're going in with a certain strategy, business model, if you will, like you said,
Yeah.
and they're not adaptive. They're not Navy SEALs. They're going with the Air Force, and it doesn't work.
And so it's almost like that business model actually undermines the strategy or the purpose there, or the calling, and so then they're finding themselves having to go somewhere else because that business model isn't adaptive enough. And I want to go back to something you just mentioned briefly and skirted over, but it's this notion of 20th century metrics. So what do 21st century metrics look like? What are you finding and discovering?
Yeah, Lisa, I love that question. I love thinking about it. And I've actually written about that earlier. See a book called Red Skies. In my chapter, it was a collaboration. Red Skies, Alan Hirsch, other people, Michael Beck, they're in this book. But in my chapter on economics, I put this in. So the premise of this thinking, and again, we talk about what are you measuring, what's your dashboard, if you will. As I began to think about this stuff a couple of years ago, and you both know, when you look around, right, numbers are going down, offerings are going down. So there's all of this, right? And you hear about the nuns and the duns, et cetera. Okay. I started realizing that most pastors in America, despite their best intentions, despite all the activity that they, create, et cetera, all well-meaning, all good intention, at the end of the day, the effect essentially is they're just managing decline.
Right. Yeah.
Most pastors in America today, in my opinion, are only managing decline. They're not reinventing, they're not disrupting, they're not creating new experts. They are simply stagnant, which ultimately means you're managing decline. Yeah. So then I started asking myself, if I'm right about that, like if I'm right, that's true, why is that? Right? And so then I started thinking about an operating system. As we all know, if you're using an operating system from 2008, and you can go online, like pastors or people listen to this, go online and write the question, what happens to you or your computer when you're using an old operating system? There's so many good metaphors in there. It goes slow. It's more likely to get bugs. It's more, there's all these things. If you take that as a metaphor, that's the church. You've got to keep your operating system up to date for it to run well, right? So then my brain went from an operating system. I said, okay, if you need to upgrade the operating system of the church, what specifically does that mean? And that's what took me to 20th versus 21st century metrics. And I realized that most pastors are still chasing 20th century metrics, nearly a quarter, 25 years into the 21st century. And that's what it is. So then I started asking myself the question, what are those metrics? Right? So here's a few of them. I already alluded to one. In the 20th century, the way people came to Christ was explanation. You brought Billy Graham to your city. He clearly explained the gospel. People got saved. You shared the 4 spiritual laws with somebody, clear explanation of God, people got saved. You gave people, Josh McDowell, more than a carpenter, evidence of demands, a clear explanation of how this man found his way to Christ-centered faith. They got saved. 21st century, it's not an explanation century, it's a demonstration century. I've already alluded to it. No one is listening. literally latest research out of Barna that's all behind what's called the He Gets Us campaign. 86% of adults in the U.S. Have a favorable view of Jesus. Do you know how many adults in the U.S. have a favorable view of the church? 11%. You know what other institution has an 11% favorability rating? The U.S. Congress.
I was going to say Congress.
If you say church,
Oh,
you
no.
just said Congress. Another thing is deity versus humanity. 86% of adults have a favorable view of Jesus and believe he was good for society. He's all this humanity stuff. But when you lead with the deity, oh, Jesus became God, instant tune out for 86% of Americans. So all that goes to the idea of the humanity of Jesus, the compassion of Jesus, the good works of Jesus. This is what you want to lead with in the 21st century, which I said earlier, it's a Matthew 5:16 century. And we have to understand that. It's not that we're not going to explain, but you're going to have to get people beyond the humanity bridge before you talk about the deity bridge. You're going to have to do good works and meet the needs of a community before they're going to listen in the 21st century. Another one is size versus influence. In the 20th century, you chase size. I encourage pastors, it's not about size, it's about influence. And the greater your diversity, again, assuming at a structural level, healthy diversity, the greater your influence as a city. When I left that large church, 5,000 bodies, but they're single demographic, white, Republican, suburban, professional class. Tons of bodies get out on a Sunday morning, but they largely went into one or two slices of the 20 slice demographic pie of the city. But if I got 100 people and I got the barrio represented, Black, Hispanic, white, we go out into 13, 15 slices of that pie. Which church has more influence? Okay, so it's not about size, it's about influence. The greater your diversity, the greater your influence. Comfort versus tension. In the 20th century, you make people feel comfortable at church. In the 21st, you got to get people comfortable with tension, right? Because that's where the unity is. And the picture of that to me is Jesus with his arms outstretched, dying on the cross, lifted up to draw all people to himself. The Republicans are on the right arm and the Democrats are on the left. And you've got everything from, rich, poor, Black, white, men, women, dare I say, sexuality holds everyone in tension. And that's where the unity is. And that's what we got to get people comfortable with in this. Obviously, homogeneity of the 20th century, 21st, multi-ethnicity, 20th century, tithes and offerings, covered everything. 21st, you're going to have to develop multiple streams of income. So those are just a few off the top of my head that goes to all the way back to we've got to upgrade the operating system. Specifically, it means you're going to have to change your metrics and in the ways that I'm suggesting and many more, if you're going to be effective and viable and not just stable and survive, but actually sustainable and thrive. That's what we're trying to, that's essentially what we're talking about for the American church.
Mark, that's so good. I think we can probably add the link to that book in the show notes, because like that T-chart of 20th century versus 21st century is like, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I know you're going to edit. It sounds like you're going off the page, but if you edit this, I'll be glad to send you, because even in our conference magazine, I got a shorter version of that. I can send you a couple, like from the book and or shorter version in a PDF or whatever. You guys can use it however you want.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. One thing that I really appreciate about you and this conversation right now, Mark, is that you seem to, tell me if I'm off here, you seem to have, both in your own leadership and in how you're seeking to help lead in Mosaix, and explore kind of framework for what's possible, as opposed to what you could call like a defensive posture. I just heard a really fascinating lecture recently by the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who basically said that neurologically, like the human brain cannot do both at the same time. You cannot be in the mode of exploration and possibility, which is what I hear from you, as opposed to defense, of the declension narrative that you were referencing. We're talking about formation. Maybe this is in part for you, but also for how you're leading. How do you invite people into a mode of exploration? What are the environments that you feel like are most critical? Maybe even some of the language. You've been really great with some of the metaphors. I'd love to know how you're inviting people to kind of follow Jesus as they follow you, in the mode of exploration?
Mhm. Yeah, that's such a deep and very good question, Tim. And while you're asking it, I'm writing down the thoughts that I have because I do think it goes to metaphor and language. When you talked about this dichotomy from, I don't remember quite how you said it because I was writing at the same time, but I heard what you said in the neurological, and you can't do both at the same time. I started thinking about the theology of all that, right? The biblical mores. And the more, if you talk to me, everything is rooted theology. I'm always going to start with the Bible, not because I'm like a big champ. It's just who I am. I can't get away from that. And so I think about this, like, for instance, faith versus fear. So when we see both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you don't see, the people in the Hall of Faith and Abraham, they leave your family, leave your country, leave everything. Where are we going? I'll show you when you get there. Verse 4, chapter 12. And so Abram left. You contrast with the Moses who hesitates, but I can't do this. I'm not a good speaker or whatever, to the point where God's like, would you just shut up and do what I'm telling you? You know what I'm saying? Like, so, and of course that there's so much of that, the faith versus the fear, which is that, and leaning in from a theological standpoint to that, love versus hate, right? So much of stewardship versus management. On the economics, a little bit back to that, right? The American church thinks stewardship, defines stewardship, I should say, as management. In other words, God gave us this building, somebody knocked a hole in the wall, we've got to repair it because we got to take care of the assets God's given us. We've got to accurately report the money that's come in. We've got to clearly communicate how we're spending the money. All of that is the language of management. Do I believe that's part of stewardship? Good steward? Absolutely. But biblically, exegetically, that's not what Jesus said. He said, hey, you give me 5, here's your 5, and I made you 5. Here's your 2, and I made you 2. One guy sat on his asset, and that person is called a wicked, lazy steward. I mentioned earlier, I think the American church is literally sitting on scores, if not billions of dollars of buried assets. It's a church that has $2.5 million in the bank. Nobody's getting saved. The 65 people in the church, they're all proud of the money they got in the bank. Nobody's getting saved. The community's not being engaged. It's a church literally in my community, it's a tiny little church that's owned 2 acres of land for 25 years. The sign says future sanctuary. You can get a commercial developer, right? You see what I'm saying? Leverage the land you have. On and on I could go. So the point is management versus stewardship, and stewardship requires measured risk, right? I'm going to take a measured risk. It's not, there's a fine line between faith and foolishness. So I think about that in terms of language. The idea of stable, I mentioned this earlier, being stable versus and surviving versus sustainable and thriving. And all of it is kind of what you're saying. I think it's in the psyche of so many, pastors in America. They're operating from more of a fear than a faith base. And they would say it's faith, but the action is some of the things we're talking about. It's management, it's fear, it's risk averse, not, take a measured risk, if you will. And all of that is not who Jesus is. Right. This guy took a great risk leaving heaven for earth, right? He on and on you could talk. He exercised faith, not fear. Where's your faith? Right. And all that. So my answer, response, Tim, to what you said is always, it just starts, this is who Jesus is. And ultimately, this is who God is and who we're called to be. But beyond that, I think metaphors also are important. Like a metaphor that I frequently use when I'm working with collective churches. Think about it. Jesus, John the Baptist really said the kingdom of God is hand. What did he mean? I mean, clearly it's not the millennial reign. Clearly it's not world peace. None of that stuff's happened. But the word means it's near. It's right at your door. It's near. But what did he mean? Well, it's Revelation 7:9, because that's what came next was the church. And the church, more specifically, the church of Acts at Antioch, not Acts 2, Acts 11. And the metaphor is we are called to be ambassadors, ministers of reconciliation, ambassadors of peace. Ambassadors live in embassies, right? So if you go to France, you walk onto the U.S. embassy, you are literally technically on U.S. land, U.S. soil, right? Churches are to be the embassies filled with ambassadors who don't speak of their own accord, who don't act of their own. They speak for king and kingdom. And when you walk into the embassy, it should feel like the kingdom, which is Revelation 7:9. When you speak, when you act, it should be the act of the ambassadors, right? In terms of peace. So that's another metaphor where you're trying both at an individual level, collective level, and move people towards something beyond themselves, something that is I think the book back in the day, right? Big, hairy, audacious goal. Or what Christianity say about our church, a big dream in Little Rock. It's a God-sized challenge, and you chase it knowing you'll never get there, because it's just like corporate sanctification, or individual sanctification, even, where I'll never be holy and perfect in this life. But that's not an excuse for me to sit back and just manage what God's given me or just kind of play it safe. So for what it's worth, listening to you, what you said, I'd love to go look at that, the brain research, where you can't do both at the same time. But I think in our own humanity, in the fall, in our culture, and certainly when it comes to the church and pastors worried about cutting jobs and or losing their own, on and on, we're risk adverse, we're living in fear, we're managing decline. And we've got to stand on the faith and the stewardship aspects, the love, not the hate, and just go for it, because that's what's going to work. One other quick thing, and I know I'm talking fast because I love this conversation, but this is Philippians 2. Christ emptied himself, right? So Paul says, since we're one in Christ and everything, don't think of your own personal interests, also the interests of others, make my joy complete. And then he says, let me give you an example of someone that did that, Jesus. He had power, position, and privilege, but he didn't grasp it. He didn't hold onto it for himself. He didn't come to be king of the hill. Remember that old game on the schoolyard?
Right.
The way you stay king of the hill is you push others down. He came to be king of the world, and that means you go down and push others up. And because he did that, his name was highly exalted, right? And all that instructs us that up is down in the kingdom of God. The very thing you think you should do is probably not what you should do. This dates me, but Jerry Seinfeld, it's bizarro world, right? It's upside down. So no, I'm not going to give into the fear. I'm going to give into the faith. I'm not going to just manage what I've been given. I'm going to take a bold risk and try to steward this stuff, and on and on. And I've got to consciously, rooted in scripture, if you will, take my thoughts captive. Right? To answer your question, if you will, because apart from that, the natural man, the trajectory of the church in this moment, it's all going to pull me to the pessimism. But I need the theology and the example of Christ and others in the Bible to force myself to take my thoughts captive and live this life with optimism. And knowing, even if I fail, I'd rather be optimistic and fail than pessimistic and live.
Beautiful.
Fabulous. And I just want to hold on to that little snippet of you talking about what it is to be sort of a servant, if you will, and a student of the gospel, that then helps you not be in a defensive posture or a fearful posture, but actually helps expand your imagination for what's possible. We often talk about the brain research that when we're struggling with something, or we're asking, we're wondering about things, that when we're given an answer, our brain actually goes into neutral. But when someone asks us a question, our neurons are on fire, right? They're then thinking and intrigued. And it's some of what you're saying, like when we, the church, think we have all the answers or are fearful about what those answers might be, then we shut down, or we stop actually being what the church is called to be. But when we really listen to the questions that Jesus was asking of us, and we open our mind to what the Holy Spirit is doing, then we're energized for the gospel and we're leaning into that. And anyway, that's my own language I'm putting. So I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I'm hearing such resonance with what we're talking about, which makes all the difference. It goes back even to the folks that you were talking about coming into inner city and not being adaptive, right? If we can't be adaptive, then the next thing you know, 5-7 years, they're pulling out of the inner city because they don't have an imagination for what's possible, and they're not adapting to what is. I'm gonna pivot us a little bit as we draw to a close. Because we've been asking our guests during this season the same question. So I want to be sure we have time to ask you this question. Um, and let me back up a minute and say, one of the premises of this whole season has been that we're always being formed, that we're always being formed. And we come in with the bias and the assumption that the church has a role in that formation, and that really, though the call of the church maybe isn't changing, the cultural realities in which the church finds itself is challenging the church to perhaps change the ways that we do formation and the particular role that we play. Just think about the things you said about 20th century metrics, which made sense in the 20th century, and 21st century metrics, which is a new way of understanding how we do church. So if we think about the ways that we're being formed all the time, our question to you is, what is one way that you're being formed right now? And what difference is it making for you?
That is so good. And I will answer it. I want to answer it. But even in the asking of the question, it brings up a couple other things that I think are really important to this discussion. So one of those was, remember we talked earlier about strategies and being adaptive and coming to the inner city. And you just mentioned how we talked about it doesn't work. And eventually you leave and you get discouraged. Hey, we tried that. What I would say to that, the other thing that is not true is people don't have the passion in their belly, right? The passion in their belly, a calling from God that you've committed yourself to in prayer. That means you will be patient and persistent until it happens. So in other words, people come in and think something's going to happen in 3 years. It takes you 7 to 10 years just to go from survival to stability.
Yeah.
And another 7, 10 years to go from survival. So people, they don't have the patience and persistence because they don't have the passion. Yeah. And the passion means God has asked me to do something. I'm going to commit to do that. That's what prayer is. And then I'm going to do it until it's done. And I got to play the long game. And people in America today, and particularly in the church, and for a variety of reasons, they don't play the long game. They're looking for quick results, get discouraged, pull out on a variety of fronts. So that's not good. The second thing that will leading to my answer is it's interesting, but in this idea of formation, you mentioned a couple of times, we're always being formed. You know what made me think, Lisa, is that none of us, everybody listening to this, the three of us here, we have zero problem thinking, yeah, I'm always being shaped, I'm being formed, whatever. But when it comes to the collective church, isn't it funny that the same people that would say, I'm being formed, what's God doing in my life right now? They don't think there's a new imagination for the church. Okay, and I'm going to tell you what I mean. So again, setting up my answer, the men of Issachar, and actually it goes on to say the families were involved. So it really is not just a gender neutral. It literally says families too. But the people of Issachar understood their moment and knew what was right to do. It means that there were thoughtful people recognizing that this is a moment unlike the past, unlike the future, and they determined what is the best course of action in this moment for the nation of Israel. And we don't have that at the moment because, again, 20th century, whatever. So if I understand, I got to be thoughtful this moment, what's the best course of action? It leads to not only my formation and the things that I would look to form me, but also the ongoing, use the word imagination or reformation, if you will, reforming the church over and over and over again. Now, again, individually, we don't have a problem thinking about that, but I dare say most pastors aren't thinking like that for their churches. So what do I mean? There's an old line. I'm old enough to know I'm finishing 40 years of full-time ministry now. I'm 61 years old. And the line I learned at an early age in terms of ministry, 21 years old, is the church is to inform culture, not the culture inform the church, right? And I'm sure everybody who's listening heard that word. And at the root of that is form, right? Or you're using the word, what's forming you? What's forming? The culture is not to inform the church. Church is to inform culture. And I used to think that, and yes, I believe that. In other words, if the culture says this is the way it's got to be, I better do it that way because that's what it said. Of course, I understand that. Like a law is passed or whatever, okay? Maybe it's contradictory to the Bible. But on the other hand, culture is always informing the church. And it should be forming the church. And here's what I mean. in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, and when I came to Christ, late 70s, and then in the 80s, in a lot of spaces, if you were divorced, you couldn't do a thing. You couldn't preach. You couldn't be on a board. It's like the old scarlet letter. You got a D on your head, and you couldn't do anything. But then, and I don't remember the exact date, but I'm going to say in the 50s and 60s, what happened? No fault divorce. It used to be a long, lengthy process. You go to court, you have to make your case, you get a divorce. Then it was like 30 days, boom, you're done. And what was happening in the culture affected the church, because now you got a bunch of Christians getting divorced and churches growing in the 80s and 90s that need bodies and volunteers and all that. And it forced opened the floodgates of divorce in American society, which also affected Christians. It forced the church to think deeper about their doctrine and practice related to people that are divorced. The same thing is happening on LGBTQ. Culture, I'm not suggesting, gay marriage is the law of the land, so every church performs gay marriage. That would be kind of the old school, right? Culture informs the church. Yeah, we've got to be more thoughtful than that. But on the other hand, with the LGBTQ community, as it has since the 60s, and let's just say coming out of the closet, whatever word you want to use, it's forced us to think deeply, because I'll just take a little vulnerable risk here. When I was a youth pastor, 1981, 82, or 84, I should say, I know I said this because I heard it. And this is just before AIDS. So people were getting sick and no one knew what it was. And I know that I said on more than one occasion, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And everybody would chuckle. And it instantly, that was the depth of the thought of the American church related to gay people. But of course, now imagine if I said that, today, right? It shows a very shallow way of thinking, and the culture has forced us as a church, as it should, to think deeper about the Imago Dei and about people and formation and all that. And it doesn't mean we check our exegesis if you're a grammatical historian out the door, but even my exegesis commands me to love all people unconditionally. So again, we're back to tension on if you're a conservative theologian in terms of grammatical historical. So the culture is always forming the church. It should be forming the church, and we should be thinking deeply about that. So with all that as a background, what is informing me in this moment? And really, it's what's informed me, I would say, for the last 10 years. I went through a midlife crisis that basically nobody knows. Now everybody listening knows, but I don't talk about a lot. My wife and family knows, but for 8 years. And I didn't even know midlife crisis was a real thing, right? I when I was a young person, if that came up, that'll never be me. I know what I'm doing. I'm gonna, But and you read about midlife crisis in men. You don't know when it starts, when it stops. Sometimes it never stops. It can last a week. It can last the rest of your life. You don't know. I very specifically know when a light switch, if you will, it went off, and boom, I was in turmoil inside. And 8 years went by, and it's like a light switch went off, and I was out. It's the craziest thing. It almost caught my marriage. If it wasn't for my wife and everything, okay? And I went through that. And what happened in the beginning of that period, being thrown, and of course, there's so many reasons, from chemical and biological to your environment, the way you were raised. I was born out of wedlock, no dad. There's so many factors that affect each of us individually, right? But in my case, up until that point, and I'm saying this was probably 2009 or 10 when I kind of entered in this moment. And I didn't choose to, it just happened. Okay. But I made a lot of wrong choices early on. And and this is all part of my formation, because up until that time, I'd been a vocational pastor from 1984 to say 2009, 2010. So whatever that is, like 25 years, I don't know. And I had very dramatically given my life to Jesus. Coming out as a freshman in college, I'm doing cocaine, drugs, and boom, I went night to day. All of a sudden I'm Keith Green. I'm living for Jesus. I'm all over the place, right? So I had this radical shift. I came out of Jesuit Catholicism, and in 3-4 months, I'm at Liberty University playing college baseball at the beginning of moral majority. These massive shifts of thought. Now, the reason I'm telling you all that, and I hope this isn't too long for your listeners, or other, you can edit it if it is. But what I learned in 2008, 2020, and when I went into this and some decisions I made and choices and how I handled that and how I didn't handle it right, all of a sudden I realized I wasn't just saved once, I'm being saved every day. And I don't think I realized that in 2009, 2010. Because if you will, I kind of had, again, I came out of that testimony, drugs. So now I'm walking with Jesus, and everything was like this escalator ride towards my pursuit of holiness. And I never made, I wouldn't even know how to tell. Of course I was sinning, but I wouldn't have known how to tell you that. I would have just gone, yeah, of course I'm a sinner. Everybody's a sinner. But probably deep inside at some level, I thought I pretty much overcome sin. And sure, every now and then I might do. But then I came face to face with my own humanity. And I realized that I'm being saved every single day of my life. But I didn't just get saved once for all. I'm being saved every single day of my life. Every single day, like David, I remember my sin. I can't get away from it. I know I'm forgiven, and God has brought everything through it. But my point is, how am I being formed? I could tell you, I read this book or whatever, and I'm always listening, I'm learning, and just like everybody. But the for the last 12 years now, at least, how I'm being formed every day is mindful of my humanity, mindful of my sin, mindful of my humanity, and realizing that I am being saved every single day of my life.
Thanks be to God for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your vulnerability, your honesty, your deep commitment to the church and to the gospel, and for all the ways that you are sharing that journey with others so that they too can dig into their deep passion and live that out in ways that make the world a better place. You really make a difference, Mark. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you guys, both of you as well, and really appreciate the opportunity to be on with you today on this podcast.